Democracy is already under a lot of pressure. Young people are already saying they would prefer an authoritarian leader. These things worry me. We just cannot afford for another failure. It's essential that the next government after Labour succeeds. It has to be a successful government. We cannot afford any more disasters. I'm Allister Heath, and once again I am responding to some of the excellent reader comments on my latest article arguing that Britain is now ungovernable. We begin this week with a comment from James Gregory. James says, "Something all parties should consider is to only select parliamentary candidates with some life experience. Enough of these characters who worked as a researcher for a think tank, union or charity. When the majority of the electorate have more experience than the politicians governing them, there's always going to be pushback." Well, yes, I think it would be very desirable if we had far more experienced and better candidates, better MPs, better ministers and so on. When you look back to the 70s or 80s or even the 50s and 60s and you look at the calibre of politicians in those days and you compare it to today's politicians, it's a terrible, terrible shock. The deterioration has been staggering. It's pathetic, frankly. But I think the key here is to upgrade the role of politicians once again in our society, in the sense of, I think they should be paid more, I think there should be fewer of them, I think they should have more power, I think the civil service and the blob should be stripped a lot of their power and influence, and politicians should be empowered, and therefore all of this together would attract better people, better politicians. I think that's the way to do it, rather than try and just say, oh, let's avoid hiring this person because he was a researcher or this person because he comes from a think tank. If the kinds of people trying to become MPs were former or current CEOs, partners in law firms, entrepreneurs, scientists, doctors, whatever, we would then, politicians, the political parties would naturally select these people, and this problem of relying on researchers or trade union officials or whatever would disappear. You just simply did not have those kinds of people becoming cabinet ministers in the 1970s or the 1980s, for example. The next comment is from Andrew Thomas. Excellent article, except that it fails to point out that this hasn't happened by chance. Andrew Thomas goes on to say, it has been brought about by the globalist cabal and their mega corporations who are the real powerhouses. Western politicians are nothing more than their puppets, Andrew Thomas writes. Well, Andrew, I disagree. I do not believe that this is the explanation. For a start, are big companies happy with the state of British politics? The answer is no. They are distraught. They think it's a complete disaster. They want better growth, better governance, better policies, more long-term thinking and so on. So if you just simply ask the big companies, you'll find out that they're not happy with this situation. So therefore, I don't think it can be argued that they are responsible or they wanted this situation. It is true that this international technocratic tendency is in the ascendancy and has been so for decades. For example, human rights lawyers, the European Union, so-called international law and so on. All of these forces have weakened the nation states and have weakened politicians and have transferred powers to these unelected bureaucracies or these semi-judicial outfits or and so on. Now, I think that is a really big problem, but I don't think it's some sort of conspiracy. That's just what the left has wanted for decades, right? But for decades, the left has said, nation states are bad, nationalism is bad, it leads to war, you need to transfer power instead to bureaucrats and international lawyers, and that way we'll have peace and prosperity. In my view, that hasn't worked. It's backfired disastrously. It's destroyed the governance of countries. It's destroyed democracy. It has disempowered the electorate. It's gone against democracy. Democracy is the demos and kratos, the power to the people. Instead, you've got juristocracy or technocracy or bureaucracy, etc. All of this is bad, but I don't see it as a conspiracy. I just think it's a problem that has to be resolved, and I think a strong leader in Britain could resolve it. Brexit was a first step towards resolving this. Unfortunately, there's a lot more of these kinds of institutions, and unfortunately, Brexit was largely thwarted by people who didn't want it to succeed. But I think we need more power to the nation states, more power to a smaller number of democratically elected and better quality politicians, and of course a much smaller state and a much bigger room for the free market and for civil society. The next comment is from Terence Beerpark. As a working class man, I can say that Labour are finished. I would never vote Tory and the country can't afford to trust them yet again. If reform doesn't win, then all bets are off. They will be replaced by something far more radical, and civil war could ensue between leftists and Islamists on one side and everyone else on the other. Well, Terence, thank you for your comments. I think a lot of working class people have turned decisively against the Conservative Party and are embracing reform. That is certainly true. On the other hand, reform for now seems to have peaked and diminished slightly in the polls, and the Tories have slightly ticked up by 1 or 2 points. So the right is quite divided in Britain, and it seems quite difficult at the moment to think that either of those two parties could win a majority on its own, which means right now, I suspect, is looking more like some kind of coalition government if indeed the right were to win. The left could win, of course, because if the right is too divided, a coalition of chaos on the left could easily gain a majority of seats in Parliament. You know, I'm talking about parties like Labour, the Greens, the Lib Dems, the SNP, the Welsh Nationalists, the Independents, and so on and so forth. So this is all quite dangerous. But I don't think there's going to be civil war. I think that's too strong. I just think the country would spiral into accelerating decline if this kind of left-wing coalition were to win. I think it's very important that it doesn't win, but I wouldn't go as far as you. Next point is from Pam Dillon. Reform is a one-issue party, but their policy on immigration is the only one that will be effective. A proper and real right-wing Conservative Party under a true blue leader, fingers crossed for Kemi, must unite with reform for 2029 and save this country. Well, as a matter of fact, I don't think Reform is a one-issue party. I mean, it started off being against the EU. Brexit was their driving issue, or the driving issue of their predecessor parties. Obviously, immigration became their dominant issue, but clearly that's not their only issue. They're a full party, and clearly they're working on policies other than just immigration. For example, net zero is one of their big policies and so on. So as a matter of fact, I would disagree with that. On the other hand, it is also true that the Conservative Party has regained quite a lot of momentum in the last few weeks and months. Maybe there'll be enough, maybe there won't be enough. Kemi Badenoch's reputation has certainly gone up. Her personal poll ratings have gone up quite significantly. Nevertheless, I think Britain is going through the same process as much of the rest of the West, which is that the old parties are dying or are going to be out of power for quite a long time. And the new generation of more populist outsider parties are gaining ground. You see this in France. You see this to a certain degree in Germany. In America, the Republican Party is basically a new party taken over by MAGA. The Democrats are a new party taken over by the far left, and so on. So I think there's a process of change going on. And I suspect the Conservative Party, even under the best possible leader, and I think Kemi Badenoch is doing a good job at the moment, won't be able to turn back that tide. We shall see. If that is indeed the case, and if Reform are not large enough to win the next election outright, then you will need a coalition. It is very important, therefore, that the two right-wing parties don't destroy each other and let in a left-wing coalition of chaos. The next comment is from Los Moz. The result is predictable, reform will fail and Britain's ongoing drift towards ungovernability will deepen. An angry and frustrated electorate might then swing sharply leftwards, perhaps towards a Green Left party promising radical change. What follows then? Well, I don't know if the result is predictable or not, but a few weeks ago I wrote a piece saying there's a 75% chance that Britain will become a banana republic. In other words, I was saying there's only a 50% chance that we get a right-wing government, maybe a Reform Tory coalition, and there's only a 50% chance that that coalition would actually succeed rather than be destroyed by the blob or make too many mistakes. So, in other words, I was saying there's a 75% chance of the sort of outcome that Los Moz is predicting, which is the electorate put all their hopes in this new government. This government fails again, so you have yet another government failing, and then the far left, the Greens and so on, sweep to power. In my view, that would be a calamity. I think they'll destroy the economy and society. You need an IMF bailout, there'll be a national bankruptcy, all that kind of stuff. But I just worry, I mean, we're running out of time here. Democracy is already under a lot of pressure. Young people are already saying they would prefer an authoritarian leader. These things worry me. We just cannot afford for another failure. The next government, it's essential that the next government after Labour succeeds. It has to be a successful government. We cannot afford any more disasters. The final comment for today is from Charles King. I agree with almost everything you write, Allister, but the idea that we can build a successful multiracial, multi-faith, colourblind, patriotic Britain is a pipe dream. These societies do not exist. The populations of the best countries are homogeneous. Well, I don't agree with that. For example, America at its best is clearly a diverse society in that respect, with all these different groups from different minorities or different racial backgrounds pleading allegiance to the American flag. Now, of course, this has been undermined in America as a result of woke ideology and other retrograde left-wing ideologies, but nevertheless, I think it is possible, and I think it has to be made to work, because that is the situation we are in, right? There's been decades of immigration. We need to make it work. It's a separate issue whether or not we've had too much immigration. I think we have had too much immigration, and it's a separate issue what you do in the future. What you do in the future is you have to have much, much, much less immigration for a very long period of time, and you have to focus on integration of people who are already here. And the key has to be, you shouldn't pay welfare benefits to people who arrive here, all that sort of stuff. But we need to make a successful multiracial, multi-faith, colourblind, patriotic society work for the sake of Britain and for the sake of the Western world. So that's all for this week. As always, thank you to everyone who took the time to share their thoughts in the comments. Please keep them coming, and we will try and respond to as many of you as we can.